If you knew Robert Gaudino, it was easy to imagine him posing a familiar question from his grave in the Williams College Cemetery.
What to do? What to do?
His death in November 1974 left his former students and colleagues asking that very question, what to do? At age 100, Kurt Tauber recalled the answer.
His students almost immediately considered to try to think of something for his memorial and came up with collected money.
The Robert L. Gaudino Memorial Fund was launched in 1975 and quickly drew contributions from alumni from Gaudino's pioneering Williams in India program and from Williams at Home, in which he sent students to stay with families in Georgia, Appalachia, Iowa, and Detroit. But older graduates kicked in as well, from when the school's leading students were drawn to Gaudino's close reading of the ancient philosophers. Gaudino's family sent money too, from California. And $6,000 came from sale of the modest home where he for years invited students to take off their shoes, enjoy cider and cookies, and discuss films or current affairs. The fund's board, composed largely of Gaudino alumni, then waited for applications for funds. But as the seasons passed, it made only a few small grants.
For years, the money sat around doing absolutely nothing. Apparently, nobody came up with any great ideas.
The underlying problem was that there was no full and complete articulation of purposes. There was no structure, there was no formal relationship to the college, and there was virtually no visibility on campus.
Herzog was part of a legendary Gaudino class dubbed the Nocturnal Council that might discuss the shadows in Plato's cave well into the night. Frustrated by the fund's inertia, he closeted himself in his Washington law office and over a weekend, in a frenzy, churned out a 51-page memo. It started by quoting Aristotle, but the last line was what counted.
The immediate need is to gain the serious interest of someone who was on the Williams faculty today.
Herzog's memo quickly made its way north to Gaudino's closest friend on the campus, whose wife for decades would tend to the grave. Philosophy professor Dan O'Connor also read it. He was dean of the college and called an extraordinary meeting at the Williams Club in Manhattan. A Gaudino student who had been spotlighted by Life magazine as a leader in the radical movements of the 60s was there. But so was the football player from Gaudino's India program, whose politics could not have been more different. The Marxist Tauber came, of course, but so did one of the leading conservative voices in America. A college trustee dropped by too, destined to become America's Secretary of State. One of the two students attending would become a poet. The other student wrote 2 articles about the weekend for the Williams Record. Today, he heads the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. They and others discussed how best to carry on the legacy of a teacher who had spent only 2 decades at their school, but showed how uncomfortable learning, in a variety of forms, could change how people viewed the world and how they lived their lives. Tauber called the outcome a brainstorm.
A brilliant flash called Gaudino Scholar.
That idea of anointing a Gaudino scholar was embraced by John Chandler, the college president who had awarded an honorary degree to Robert Gaudino right as a rare neurological illness was claiming his life. In the decades since, 18 faculty members have held the title Gaudino Scholar, each freed from teaching a class for 2 to 3 years so they could pursue Gaudino initiatives. After the first few, none ever met the man whose legacy they inherited.
I did not know Bob Gaudino. Look what Bob Gaudino did. Look at the impact he had. Again, it's all about transformation at the end of the day. And Bob Gaudino transformed his students in powerful, existential ways. But there are other ways of transforming individuals in profound and existential ways. And so I think we just celebrate that he did that, and other people are doing that as well. And that's how I look at it.
Even today, Egypt still permeates my life.
I really felt I needed to test myself and see what I was made of.
It was like going to Mars.
Williams in CAIRO was the brainchild of the first Gaudino Scholar. Ray Baker was a veteran of the political science department, but was skeptical of the mystique surrounding his late colleague. He saw Robert Gaudino's gifts as idiosyncratic, impossible to duplicate. Baker was not about to plunk students alone in remote Indian villages or in Appalachia. Participants in Williams and CAIRO would be based at the American University there and take a full load of courses. Baker was confident that the city around it would provide the experiential education.
CAIRO was the ultimate classroom.
I grew up as a kid of 2 public school teachers in Southern California. I went to Williams College. This was the Eastern establishment. These are kids who learned how to cocktail party when they were 12. I struggled to get by. I worked in the dining hall. Sophomore year, the director of financial aid called me into his office, sat me across from him at his desk, and smiled and looked at me and said, "Some people just can't afford Williams."
In Egypt, his experience was molded by an upset stomach.
First few weeks, I ate on the street stands every night, and I drank all the water from the tap, and I was terribly sick. So it was time for me to learn how to cook myself. I went into the downtown food marketplace, the Souk Babaloup, and I went to get eggs.
My first impression was a big, dark, stinky, scary, chaotic place.
But he soon decided that he had stumbled upon a microcosm of life itself.
And the place I went to get eggs, there was a young man named Hassan there. And between his broken English and my broken Arabic, we gained this powerful friendship. The downtown food marketplace was like nothing I'd ever seen. I absolutely loved it. And I ended up spending 2 to 5 hours every day just hanging out there.
Years later, Stephen Farley would publish a book about what became his home away from home.
I taught him English, he taught me Arabic, and we befriended a lot of other people in the souk. Sammy was a kid who was small for his age. He had rickets. Hassan had taken it upon himself to teach him how to read. The souk itself was incredible at being able to have everybody take care of what everybody else needed. There was Sharbat, who was almost thought of as the village idiot, but she was also treasured because she made people laugh. There was a guy who collected all of the trash from the vegetable stands, and then he sold them to the pig sellers who fed their pigs with them. There was a guy who collected newspapers, and he sold them to the vegetable sellers so they'd have something to wrap their vegetables with. Everybody found a niche, so it was an incredible shock when one day, out of a squabble between Hassan's dad and his neighbor, another shop owner, over frozen vegetables, Sammy got caught in the middle and boom, he was gone. Never a chance to say goodbye. It made me understand life isn't always fair.
You never knew what you were going to learn every day. There was always something new, and sometimes they were hard lessons.
Mary Flanagan learned hard lessons as well, though she was not your typical student doing a year abroad.
I had spent my high school years in Iran. My dad was a career military officer working in Iran and had brought the family over there for that tour of duty. We ended up getting caught up in the revolution and were evacuated out of Iran on the Shah's jets, actually.
Mary found herself echoing a popular advertising campaign.
The name of the paper that I wrote was called Do Blondes Have More Fun?
Mary's answer, yes, atop a camel. No on the streets of Cairo. She wrote of dodging not only the traffic, but stares, catcalls, and gropes.
I really stood out and was often a bit of a target.
During a group trip, she went jogging alone in the desert.
I had gone out for a run. I was wearing shorts, which I normally would not have done, but I figured there was nobody around. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this truck full of soldiers pulls up, armed men. They were laughing and kind of approaching towards me. And I look over my shoulder, and just unbeknownst to me, Pete Anthony is running over the hill. He had decided to go for a run too. As he got closer and closer, I'm like, hey, Pete, over here. He came up and they saw that I was with someone, and so they sort of backed off. That could have gone quite differently. So
she just said, oh, hi, Pete, and put her arm in my arm, and we, and then I guess these other guys took note, and I didn't even know what was going on.
Mary was one of the ones who had the strength and the ability to persist. She figured out ways of getting all of these young men and boys to stop harassing her everywhere she went. They learned phrases like, I'm your mother's age. Don't you have any sisters?
The things that we just take for granted could be quite different there. We're studying Shakespeare, and the play we were reading was Romeo and Juliet. One of the Egyptian guys in the back of the class finally raised his hand. He said, I don't really get this idea, because my parents had an arranged marriage, and all the heads were nodding because a lot of the people in the class had arranged marriages. They weren't allowed to have that romantic kind of interaction that we just take for granted. And we also went to the Valley of the Kings, where King Tut was discovered. So I was with my roommate, and she and I had our guide, Muhammad, who took us around the Valley of the Kings by donkey. You're really getting into this rhythm of the desert. The sun's beating on you, but it's gorgeous. And by the end of it, Muhammad had proposed that my roommate be his fifth wife.
Pete Anthony experienced the clash of cultures during an internship with an American Foreign Service project. The American Marine barracks had just been bombed in Beirut, Lebanon. In Egypt, the assassination of President Anwar Sadat was a fresh memory.
There was just sort of a electrical, palpable, tension with everything all the time. I had an internship that Baker set up for us at USAID. In particular, I was in a division called WID, Women in Development, to improve the status of women. Not having kids at a young age, but waiting till later, staying in school, having access to birth control. In that culture, women looked at their power as coming from having a family, so having kids, and then becoming brokers between families or tribes. It was such a misfire. The Middle East had blown up in around the same time, in the late 70s, early 80s, and we were out trying to get women to not have babies, to take birth control, stay in school, and not get married.
But Pete loved what he found on the streets.
We were out kind of wandering Cairo late at night. That's when we found out that there was a local music scene. A group of young Cairenes around, you have a fire or some sort of light source, and they'd be playing these instruments, and these young women would be dancing, and it's like the Star Wars cantina scene, For me, this is completely out of my element, completely different than anything I'd heard. Whether it's supposed to make you want to dance or it's supposed to calm you down, all the things that music does for people. There's belly dancing involved, but it wasn't belly dancing like you saw at a hotel or something. No, the dancing was incredibly earthy and sexy, and we couldn't take our eyes off them. And here we were in a conservative Muslim country. had a ball. I mean, we had, it was so wild. I talk about it all the time.
Pete talks about it today as one of Hollywood's leading conductors of music for films. Mary stayed in CAIRO an extra semester, then a summer more, before returning to Williams.
It gets in your blood a little bit. Over time, you start to get to know the city, and I found it intriguing. I thought it was amazing. And you just have to give yourself up to CAIRO. It's not going to change for you. You know, you have to kind of fit yourself in and just follow the adventure wherever it takes you. And when I graduated from Williams, I was able to land this consulting job with Deloitte doing international projects all over the world. It was actually through a lot of my contacts and connections there that we founded our first office for Deloitte in CAIRO. Even today, Egypt still permeates my life. In fact, when I was decorating this room, I had these little camel saddles made, kind of made over in a fabric that would match the exterior. And this is actually what you would have on a camel.
Steve Farley kept taking photos when he returned to the Berkshires, but not of the pristine campus. He focused on working people and the poor. He kept a similar focus when he settled in Tucson, in two professions.
I learned in CAIRO that you take things at face value. You understand that your own perspective isn't always the right one. It made me an effective legislator, I think, ultimately, once I got in that situation. I served in the Arizona legislature for 12 years and then a senator for 3 terms. And I was not in the majority. So the important thing was being able to figure out how to talk with people you disagreed with.
Today, if you visit downtown Tucson, you'll see the giant murals he erected in his non-political career.
Ultimately, I did a public art project where some of the interviewees had brought in photographs of people walking down the street in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and we put them up on the wall 18 feet high. And they were a picture of the diversity of Tucson, the history of Tucson, and the vibrancy of a downtown that at that time was completely down on its heels. The mayor at that time, Bob Walkup, when he spoke with the dedication of the mural, said, "I think this is the beginning of the Renaissance." And it turned out to be.
The very first Gaudino Scholar initiative continued on for more than a decade, exposing scores more Williams students to the trials and glories of CAIRO. Kurt Tauber stated his goal bluntly.
Up the voltage of our students' intellectual interest.
But his marquee initiative as the second Gaudino Scholar faced a challenge in the freshman quad's entry, William C.
So our T-shirt of William C. for 1986-1987, the front of it simply said William C. 1986-1987. But on the back, it said, "We're not like an intellectual entry."
Kurt Tauber was a refugee from Vienna who first studied chemistry at Harvard. He was wary of Williams' reputation as a school for unserious gentlemen, as described to him by an old alumnus.
He says, "When I was at Williams, I learned a very good game of golf. I don't remember that I ever cracked a book."
But after being reassured that Williams students did now read, he joined the political science department in 1960 and became a colleague of Bob Gaudino. Tauber's study of post-war Germany spanned 1,598 pages and needed 600 pages just for his footnotes. No wonder his report on his years as Gaudino Scholar ran 88 pages and outlined 35 proposals for a campus where, quote, experimentation and innovation
have traditionally been more suspect than welcomed.
And it was quite wide-ranging from very small proposals about setting up an Office of Graduate Advising or something like that, but to also quite broad proposals. The interest group housing proposal, the idea is that a group of people who are interested in a particular idea, whether the environment or civil rights or whatever the idea was, that they could try to live together.
Student-initiated courses, a science fair, and so on. Just proposals. Talbert did get to show the unsettling documentaries made by Williams alumnus Fred Wiseman, but so few students showed up, he pulled the plug in the middle of a screening at Bronfman Hall. The results, he wrote, were disastrous.
All kinds of initiatives to push the intellectual life of our students. And the one idea that was the most effective at the time was a freshman presidential seminar. Actually, I think worked.
He's like, I don't know if we can get the school to adopt this. This freshman residential seminar is like a really big idea. It was really a way of getting students to bring the ideas that they were encountering in the classroom into their dorm, into their bedrooms.
It was approved, however, and 67 incoming students applied for 45 places in 2 entries in the historic quad. They would both live together and take an interdisciplinary course together each semester.
I think FRS did attract people, some unique characters, right? It's interesting. I think some people were very Williams-ish and they wanted to be in the freshman quad and it was a guarantee to get in. So there were that component. They couldn't care whatever FRS, they didn't care. That's why they did it. But others thought it sounded like a really interesting, creative, let's try it.
Took a bus from Kansas City to Williamstown. I don't recommend doing that. Was more or less a zombie by the time I got to the campus. They were going to be doing the big kind of kickoff cocktail party, wine and cheese, whatever. Again, things that you do not normally get when you're in suburban Kansas City. I do remember, I think that was the first time I saw Kurt Tauber, kind of like straight out of Central Casting. I mean, he had the Continental thing going on.
Co-taught by physicist David Park, their first shared course was on, quote, the uses of evidence, ways of knowing, whether about black holes or in Shakespeare or even in football. Chris remembered a provocative reading about a coach who would not let his players tackle in practice. But he remained skeptical of the program's grand vision.
I think Kurt Tauber was trying to plant German corn in Yankee soil, that kind of middle Europa ideal of what he thought a collegiate experience should be.
An entry mate, Katrina, took photos all year, reminding us that these were 18-year-olds trying to figure out college life and who they were, with alternating moments of teen angst and gleeful abandon. But Katrina also kept a diary that noted how the classroom did filter into the dorm, say after they saw a film about sex workers in their second semester course about public and private morality, led by philosophy professor Rosie Tong. That's when the women signed a petition to get the men to take down racy pictures in their common room upstairs. The physics major from South Carolina said you also interacted differently in class when you lived with each other.
You run into somebody in class and they have a particular position that you don't agree with. But if it's somebody that you know and you've seen in all these other different contexts, you have a much more multifaceted view of them and you're not going to just write them off as somebody, who's just this weirdo that you don't want to have anything to do with. So I think you learned to not really stereotype people and to see that they can be multifaceted. There was somebody in the entry who, man, he just ate about 5 things like peanut butter sandwiches all the time and seemed like he was interested in partying and stuff, but he also could make some very insightful comments and, was a smart guy.
Katrina found herself immortalized in modern fashion at the end of the year, when U.S. News elevated Williams to the top of its rankings for the first time. To illustrate the #1 college in America, the magazine used a photo of Professor Tong and her students in the freshman residential seminar. Kurt Tauber's marquee initiative would go on for an astounding 25 years, a quarter century. But that first crew had distinctions beyond the rankings designed to sell magazines. In his closing paper, Kurt featured the words of Jane Penner, whose father had attended Williams and studied under Robert Gaudino. In her own final paper, Jane echoed Katrina's observation that in other classes you easily stereotyped other students. But here they also were in your entry or even in your room. Jane's roommate was a promising art student.
You know, Jane was this blonde Midwestern, kind of big-eyed, doe-eyed, almost cheerleader-ish, with a lot of pastel sweaters and Layla is African-American, biracial, from Buffalo, and sort of a much tougher, like short hair, not fancy, seemingly brusque on the outside. And so they were roommates, and they just seemed like chalk and cheese on the surface, right? Like nothing in common. And I'm not sure, I think in the beginning, they both sort of judged each other a little bit.
There was talk of finding a single room so they could be separated, until they began speaking late at night, bed to bed, after the lights went out.
Over the year, Layla and Jane sort of slowly discovered who each other were, right? And actually started to spend time together, and became friends. At the end of the year, we had a come as your roommate party. And Layla had like straightened her hair and came in this like lame silver like coat that was like over the top, but very Jane, like they wore each other's clothes. And Jane came in, I don't remember, but like suspenders and jeans, and just like, it was such a hilarious, dramatic kind of contrast, because it was so Layla and so Jane, but they came as each other.
The legacy kid in the not intellectual entry graduated Phi Beta Kappa, while the art student graduated onto the Williams College faculty. From its inception in January 1968, Winter Study provided the perfect opportunity for Williams students to goof off, take a class outside their norm, or go searching for otherness. Say by studying family dynamics in Laos, or music in Bangladesh, or leprosy in Ethiopia, where a pre-med athlete discovered that some patients walked 100 miles barefoot to get care. The Gaudino Fund also sent students to intern at an inner-city high school, though in the Gaudino tradition, that experience might puncture the idealism of a student who found teachers there rude and on a power trip. No one would say that about Jeff Thaler, a veteran of Gaudino's Williams at Home program, who for 8 years invited Williams students to spend January living and working with immigrant families in Portland, Maine. But of scores of Gaudino winter studies, none linked experiences far off to those on campus, like one led by a sophomore who defied the credo, "You can't go home again."
Tom States wasn't your typical Williams College student. He had grown up in the Mississippi Delta. His father had picked cotton. He researched Macaulay and talked his way into Macaulay, one of the top private schools, boarding schools in the South. And I think he talked his way into Williams too. And I was assigned to be his advisor.
The fourth grade teacher would always ask me the same question. Are you swimming towards shore, or are you barely treading water? When I first jumped ship, it was the first. I was barely treading water.
Kurt Tauber threw Tom's first paper in the trash, but then became a mentor, inviting Tom over to his home to discuss political philosophy and sometimes to sample one of the famous Tauber dinners. Kurt also connected Tom with the current Gaudino Scholar when he proposed leading a winter study in January 1993.
The idea was to take students from Williams College of different disciplines and different social economic backgrounds down to Mississippi to collect oral histories from persons that are still living on or affiliated or associated with the plantation where their family were slaves or and sharecroppers.
Tom choreographed everything, made all the arrangements. I kind of feel like we were some guinea pigs on some level.
He got Julian Bond to somehow sponsor the thing and to take us to dinner in Atlanta.
Him.
Both Chris and Jenny had fathers who had gone to Williams. One of her vivid memories was how some of their interviews ended.
And so we have, I think, 2 or 3 different people singing Amazing Grace, which was extremely powerful for me.
At the end of their trip, Chris would share a succession of memories.
If you haven't driven so deep into the cotton fields that you can't see anything around you but the red clay mud, if you haven't had people explain to you how the Bible demands segregation, if you haven't heard the blues drifting across the air on a dark, muggy night, if you haven't eaten fried chicken and catfish and cornbread for 6 days in a row, if you haven't had your breath taken away when the big river leaps out in front of you as you round a curve in the road, if you haven't been to Graceland or drank moonshine, if you haven't seen the poverty or the filth or the pride or the magnolias or the looks that are thrown when a black man is talking to a white woman, well, then you can't even begin to answer the question.
Between taking oral histories, Tom took them to meet his relatives on the Avon plantation.
This is where my father's side of the family lived and worked as sharecroppers, starting from emancipation, Reconstruction, all the way back through. When we pulled out of the 2 vehicles onto the Avon plantation and walking up to my great-grandmother lived here and my aunt lived right here. And so we're walking up there and my aunt starts counting us as we're coming towards the house. And then she walks, not out to greet us, but she walks back towards the house, picking up chickens and wringing their necks because she's getting ready to prepare dinner. When I took the students to visit my father's mother, my grandmother, and she was living in the shotgun shack, and she didn't have insulation, so she used quilts for the walls. She had like a gas fire heater, and because she was older, necessarily couldn't make it to the bathroom, she had a bucket beside her bed.
My mother is a white woman from Dothan, Alabama. Father is a black man from Little Rock, Arkansas. I wasn't allowed to visit my mother's white side of the family in the South, northern Florida, southern Alabama, until maybe my senior year in high school. But the Mississippi poverty was like another level. I went with Tom to visit some of his family. And that's where I saw, got the most intimate connection to the poverty and the outhouses and how people were living. There's very few from Mississippi that go to Williams, period. He wasn't just a black kid from Mississippi. He was a black kid from, deep poverty in Mississippi, Mississippi being the poorest state.
The level of the poverty, I think, stunned us.
So when we got back to the house that I had rented for the group, I got out of the car to go inside, and I turned around, and they were all still sitting in the car. And then finally, I think it was Dietrich that came in and told me that they were in the car crying.
Greenwood was not far from where Emmett Till was kidnapped, tortured, and killed in 1955 for supposedly whistling at a white woman in a country store while he was in town visiting from Chicago.
Emmett Till's relatives were members of my grandfather's church. So the house where they came to pick up Emmett Till, I saw out the church window every time we went to church.
The store now was owned by the family of one of the jurors who had acquitted suspects in the murder. Jenny and Chris went there, posing as customers, naively believing they might gather new evidence.
When Chris and I walked into that grocery store, there was very little on the shelves. There was a, noticeable layer of dust. It looked like the candy bars had been last stocked, back in the 60s, and it was eerie. I had a tape recorder in my purse. We walked in, we kind of played the role of, kids not really knowing, kind of wondering. So they started feeling a little bit suspicious, uncomfortable. And eventually we left and kind of looked at each other like, well, oh, well, we tried.
There was enormous hostility, sort of beaming out towards us.
We didn't really know what we were getting into. That we would then, after our visit to the store, experience as we were chased out of town in a pickup truck.
Along with Tom and Diedrich, they headed next to the barn where Till had been killed.
That's when we found ourselves being chased off by unknown persons in a vehicle. I mean, at speeds. It wasn't like we were booking it. I'm sure that the students didn't think of themselves as outside agitators. But I promise you that the people in the town did. It was a gravel road. Well, I'm talking country, like, and we were trying to get through that to get to the clearing, to get to the destination of this place where they had tortured and killed Till.
All of a sudden, we saw another big pickup truck sort of coming across the fields, kind of completely disregarding the rows of plantings and things like that, and kind of really coming fast towards us.
Yeah. You know what I mean? You laugh afterwards to kind of let off the fear.
And then we just hightailed it out there, and they basically chased us all the way till we got out, and then we took off.
When they finally headed home from the warm South, their caravan got frosty news from their own campus.
We pulled over to get gas or something, and somebody mentioned they'd heard about Williams on the radio. Williams had suspended class for a day, that they had called a convocation in the chapel because there were 3 notes found on the door of the Black Student Union. The impression was that white students had put it on the door.
The notes used the usual vile, racist language, but they were not the work of a white student. A black student soon admitted writing them to stimulate intellectual discourse, he said. When he was suspended for a semester, other black students threatened to boycott. The debate raged on, and in the middle was Tom States. Writing in the record, Tom interwove his experiences in Mississippi with amazement that a fellow student would see the need to fake racism. But the pushback was immediate from other black students. One mocked him as, quote, "our resident, authentic Southern black man."
Black students at Williams that come from, that don't know that background, they didn't come from that part. Maybe their family did before the Great Migrations, but they thought I was posing. They thought I was trying to borrow the credibility of an authentic Southern person. I'm it.
He would invite me to lunch, and I would have just read in the paper something he was doing. And I said, are we going to get tomatoes thrown at us or something? Are you going to stir something up there? Can we just go have lunch in the dining hall? And he had a great laugh. He goes, "Oh, we'll be all right." And I go, "Okay." And I was just so proud of him when he got elected class speaker. For him to be recognized in that way, I think says a lot about him and Williams also.
There were no wet floors, but the caution signs went up anyway. They were covered with provocative messages from anonymous college employees.
Why do you treat me like I'm not human?
Will whoever is peeing all over the toilet seats please stop?
The advice was sometimes gentle, like live your dreams. Sometimes it was about privilege. What gives you the right to vomit on the floor every weekend at 3 a.m. and then I have to clean it up?
Mitch Stripling was part of a mysterious group whose name was drawn from an old corporate slogan.
Avon calling.
We came up with the name Just Another Avon Lady.
There was no mention of the Gaudino Fund or its unique scholar.
I must confess I didn't even know about the Gaudino Fund until I was approached to serve as scholar.
She was an expert in early and religious music and the first scholar from any of the arts.
Very welcoming, and I think excited that as a Div 1 person I would be someone able to come up with some perhaps new ideas, stretching the envelope, as it were.
She said, I think art can be powerful.
My inclination was very much to keep it local. I knew of the experiences they had all had in studies abroad programs under Mr. Gaudino's auspices, and I felt strongly that there was plenty of discomfort on the campus and ways to make people more uncomfortable.
Senior lecturer Peggy Diggs was a key ally. A veteran artist herself, she was a fan of a New York-based group that had creative ways to make political statements.
Over my shoulder here is where we first put up our very first public art project that we did for World AIDS Day, which was a giant wall in the shape of an A, and we built it in the theater a couple of streets over, and then 2 or 3 in the morning we shuttled it over here. Nobody knew who we were doing it, but there were 8 or 10 students with hammers and saws, and it was a white surface. People could write on it. It's only up for a couple of days.
In most Gaudino initiatives, participants volunteered for their discomfort. Not here.
Like the AIDS epidemic itself, it presented itself in such a way that you could not avoid it. Being positioned in front of Peresky, almost in front of the doors, people had to go around it. They had to negotiate it. So in that way, it was designed to provoke and engage, which is always a risk because that can make people angry.
There was some homophobia. There was some insensitivity, but there were also people put their coming out stories on the A. They put their sort of messages of sympathy and empathy for people with HIV, but then it was gone really quickly. And the problem was there was some trolling on there. So when you have a giant art wall, even if there's 10% of the comments are trolling, it's very visible. That's what shakes people. And so we painted it over. The second project we called the Dummy Project, and we hung 7 gray dummies, again, here in the Student Union at night. Nobody knew who did it. And this one went bad much faster. There were slurs that were put in. There was a figure that was labeled as gay who was sort of hog-tied. Jennifer Luxman and I put this sort of "this is not a racist campus" blindfold on because people weren't sort of realizing the tenor of what they were doing. But we got a lot of criticism for the project itself.
Some of the black students on campus were not comfortable with the idea of suspending dummies from the ceiling.
The team of us who were doing it met with the Guerrilla Girls on this. They did a critique of this project. I don't know who they were. They came in wearing gorilla masks. And they were really critical of the project too, because they said that we had designed, in my memory anyway, kind of a trap for people, because it was sort of like we were inviting them to use stereotypes on the project. And then when they followed through, they were then criticized for it, and there was no way to elevate the discourse.
Their project delivering messages from campus employees went no more smoothly, even though some were totally benign.
If you think there should be more veggie offerings, make your case to dining services.
Students emailed in their displeasure.
I didn't come to college to continue being nagged by someone who thinks they're my mother.
Please don't send any more advice, Avon lady.
The level of criticism was so brutal and also unfair. Like, clearly there were class issues at play on the Williams campus. Clearly this was a real thing we were tapping into.
In her scholars report, Bloxham agreed they'd had difficulty fostering constructive conversation, thus following a Gaudino tradition of candid self-criticism. Yet, as with many Gaudino projects, she couldn't know the long-term impact.
For 20 years now, I've been managing emergencies of all kinds for state and local governments. I'm now at Columbia. I run a Preparedness and Recovery Institute there. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Ebola, COVID, all of these things have these moments of crisis that you have to manage through. I think this, in many ways, was the most vital part of my education here. I've worked in a lot of conflict, intense situations with real hostility where people are confronting inner biases and hatreds that they didn't want to admit to because of the urgency of the moment. And this work was the closest analog to that I got at college. Knowing that when you touch a nerve, people will react, right? Knowing that there can be sabotage, that people are going to false flag it. You know, all the sort of memes and cliches of internet discourse, you know, we were sort of uncovering and living through, and it felt like it was the first time for everybody.
When a new virus threatened gay men, he was tasked with helping avoid the mistakes made with AIDS and COVID.
There wasn't a good test for it. So we brought the FDA together, we brought the diagnostics manufacturers, and we brought activists together. They were very angry at each other. Nobody was listening. And it was a very Gaudino-like room.
Some years ago, I was invited to a place I never expected I would be. That was the inner sanctum of the CIA in Langley, Virginia. The occasion was to attend a ceremony where CIA was awarding its highest civilian honor to a Williams professor.
From the first scholar on, Gaudino forums were part of the mix. Philosophy professor Sam Fleischacker made them a centerpiece of his tenure. Then political science professor Mark Reinhardt began holding them even more frequently.
On every Monday night, there was a gathering space.
Then this, just as a new scholar was taking over.
It's always a great pleasure.
Bob Jackal trained to be a Jesuit priest before turning to sociology. His gentle manner earned the trust of insiders in the worlds of drug gangs, corporate managers, police detectives, and Madison Avenue advertising gurus.
We never had to suggest ourselves that the Gaudino Fund was the right vehicle for creating an opportunity for reflection on those events. Professor Jackal was on this immediately, almost before the smoke settled.
A future Gaudino scholar was among the speakers at Jackal's first event.
I didn't really know Bob before 9/11. He's sociology, I'm political science. But Bob instantly took the lead. The first night when we had that big forum in Chapin Hall, over 1,000 people for sure. Most of the questions were the kind of questions you would expect from a very liberal college campus. I think the legacy of Vietnam still had a kind of big role, which is, somehow America is about to get involved in things that it shouldn't.
Two editors of the college newspaper said many students expressed the belief that America had gotten what it deserved. Bob quickly brought in 21 alumni who had witnessed the horrors that day.
Without Bob, I think we would have had a very kind of safe, politically correct forum and dialogues about 9/11. Bob said, no, we're gonna talk about issues of homeland security, American national security. We're going to talk about the origins of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism, issues like that.
A college official summed up what came next.
Over the next 3 years, Bob brought to campus scores of men and women from all over the world, scholars, soldiers, spies, journalists, activists, government officials, men and women from the left, right, and center of the political spectrum.
One word leaps out of the list: spies. It was no secret that schools such as Williams had helped staff the CIA from the start. A Williams president helped launch America's intelligence operation at the onset of World War II. A graduate headed the CIA during the Vietnam War. That's when protesters blocked the CIA recruiter from campus, forcing other students to meet the man quietly off-site. Years later, a new generation of students tried to make a citizen's arrest of a CIA recruiter. Bob Jackal brought the spooks out of the shadows. First, the retired Richard Helms himself, then an unlikely substitute after Helms fell ill.
I also benefit from the counsel of several agency veterans, chief among them Steve Kappas,
the highest active operations officer in the CIA.
I was walking down the hall one day and I was approached by the director, George Tennant, and asked if I wanted to go take Mr. Helms's place and provide the lecture at Williams College. I asked a couple of questions and said, yeah, I'd be interested. So away we went. It was the first time I was ever going to ever stand in front of a crowd and say, how do you do? I'm Stephen Kappas from the CIA. So my daughter, who was of college age or a high school senior, she went with me. My joke at the beginning of the lecture was that I brought her with me, so if I passed out when I admitted I was CIA, somebody could get me home.
Kappas thought it would be a one and done, but he kept being asked back, both for forums and the courses Jackal developed under the Gaudino Fund banner. His terrorism class alone drew 91 students and a dozen community members.
Faculty, particularly today, have a real blind spot, and they always bring in other people just like themselves who also teach at universities or liberal arts colleges.
One of his strengths was he wasn't afraid to have what he called, people like me, he called practitioners. In some ways we were breaking new ground. Every class that I lectured from then on to the outer years was always a full house, and he made it quite clear to them that we'd be talking about things that could be difficult issues, and that if you don't want to do that, don't sign up for the class. The first one, it was about the terrorism question, the question of the threat, and then within limits, of course, the question as to how the United States was responding to the threats, but then it evolved into a broader sense of the intelligence business, operations and analysis, the support and the uses of technology.
I was quite surprised, given from my background, someone like that would never come in to speak to a class, in Eastern Europe for sure, or they would come with like 50 guards, right?
Of course, when you talk about espionage, everybody's interested in the on the ground meeting of foreign agents. And my first tour, I had to use a vehicle to meet an agent, and the vehicle was in bad shape. So I'm picking him up at a dark part of the town we were in. All of a sudden, the car literally explodes, smoke's pouring out the back, and we go down the road. And he looks at me and says, "Have you been doing this very long?"
There were some quote unquote tough questions asked, right? There were even questions around, how could they make so many mistakes on certain topics, including the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
If students wanted to speak privately with me, there was always a time set aside. There was a particular student later on. He had on his own initiative decided to play golf, I think in all 48 continental states of the United States. He's exactly the kind of curious, self-motivated, engaging, almost charismatic type of person that certainly on the operational side we would be looking for. I told him, I said, well, you've got some interesting talents, but he was a smart lad, so he understood what I was talking about. But I told him, I said, well, professor knows how to find me if you're interested.
Dylan DeChier never did go undercover, but you can find him on a cover of a magazine as a writer, or see him on YouTube and Netflix. Bob Jackal, however, did make it to CIA headquarters, first under a grant to examine the culture of spies like Kappas, much as he had studied street cops and business executives. Then he came back for the ceremony that was a private affair.
I think he was quite taken by it all, not expecting it.
I had the honor to speak on behalf of Williams College. I found it very emotional when you're confronting people who are really doing this stuff at great peril for themselves. I said to them, thank you for what you do, and thank you for Professor Jackal for what he's done to help more people kind of understand better what you do here. And that's why he was being honored.
A flying scoop of Purple Cow ice cream changed my college experience and then ultimately my life. I was a freshman. I just arrived on Williams College campus. I've been there probably a month or so, and the math department was having an ice cream social. It was being held in Goodrich Hall, and there was a big banner that said free ice cream. I thought I could sneak in there, grab a bowl of ice cream, and get out unnoticed. I was not taking any math courses that semester, and I was in line, and I was scooping the Purple Cow ice cream into a bowl, and I scooped a little too hard, and the ice cream shot off of the spoon and went flipping through the air and landed on Professor Berger's shoe. And I look up and he says, "Are you going to wipe that off?" And of course, from this, I end up majoring in math as well as philosophy. And 3 years later, as a senior, Professor Berger invites me into this crazy course that he calls Exploring Creativity.
Ed Berger once taught a winter study course in comedy writing.
When you are frustrated because you can't...
He might write math formulas as if conducting an orchestra.
...working on, and yet... I see. you can't top that.
And he could have been a 60 Minutes correspondent, judging from a series of Gaudino dialogues with prominent alumni, including dealmaker Herbert Allen.
So I want to talk about your wealth for a moment. And then we can move on, okay?
Do you want me involved, or are you just...
No, I think I can handle it pretty well, actually, especially if you give me the checkbook. I can take care of it quite nicely. Now, you have actually known a lot of people who've run for president and lost.
Yeah, they never get over it. I don't think politicians ever get over the rejection of the American public. And so from that standpoint, it's an emotional thing. Politicians and actors have a lot in common.
Learning from failure was a theme, and he extended it to one of the most remarkable classes ever assembled at Williams College.
My very first year at Williams College as a brand new faculty member back in 1991, one of my colleagues in the math department was just named the Gaudino Scholar. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she explained, well, it's a chance to do some innovative stuff and do things that are interesting. And then she said to me, and I hadn't been on campus for a month, and she said, so, do you have any ideas? And I said, I always wanted to teach a course that would touch on lots of disciplines, like art and philosophy and math and some other thing. But I had the germ of what ended up becoming this course, Exploring Creativity, which I offered in 2008 when I became a Gaudino Scholar.
He invited 3 students in each of those disciplines, plus music, to teach their fields to students from the other majors. That meant the art types would have to grapple with questions concocted by the mathematicians, but then they'd get to turn the tables and take the math and philosophy whizzes outside their comfort zones.
The most trying one was probably in music when we were asked to make a composition.
Ruth Aronoff was a double major in geology and anthropology, but she was enlisted for her musical virtuosity.
One of my close friends who was in the class and had a different, specialty, and this friend asked me, I don't understand when you say that notes are higher or lower. And then I was like, oh, yeah. That would be really confusing if you have no music background whatsoever. So I sang a note, had them try to match it. And so then I said, okay, now you like keep holding that, and I'm gonna now sing a lower note and you can try and match that. And they never got it the whole time.
One of the other students called philosophy major Jeff Kaplan the smartest kid on campus.
In not every element of the course did I discover, oh, I really have some natural talent, amazingly. No, that did not happen in the studio art portion of the course. Maybe a tiny bit it happened in the music portion of the course. To illustrate boredom, they told us we could only use 2 notes, but they didn't say how long, so I did something like this. And there was an eruption. Everybody got it. It was very exciting, and I was surprised that I, did something worthy of a group reaction. But to have to go into the studio art building at night alone and work on a charcoal drawing was terrifying.
And one of the exercises that they gave us, the studio art students gave us, was to do a self-portrait. It was a charcoal exercise. And so I got a mirror, and got this big sheet of paper because they wanted it big, and look at this, look at the, image there, and I try to draw it and it was really something. And while I was doing this, Manny came in.
He was a sophomore scholarship student without a major who had to finagle his way into the class of seniors.
I was an inter-campus mail carrier. I was an usher at the theater, and I worked at the Goodrich Coffee Bar. I was a member of Nothing But Cuties, the hip-hop dance troupe, and I was a little annoyed by how homogenous the campus was, and so I dressed a little bit eccentrically, and I did walk around with a boombox and play music. And I had found out who the best professors were, and there was this competition of who could get into these classes. But I did stop Professor Berger on the street a couple times and told him that I should be in the class. And he said it was for seniors only. And I said it would be good to have someone in there as a bit of a mole who wasn't actually deeply embedded in one of the fields, but could kind of throw everyone off a little bit. And somehow I was able to convince Ed that I could realistically teach philosophy, even though I'd never taken a philosophy class before. So I would love to know from him why he allowed me in this class.
This was a young man who had so much energy as a 19-year-old or whatever, 18-year-old, he was bouncing off the walls. And he said, I have to get in this class. This class is everything to me. And I was so dubious, and yet he sold it.
On the day that we were supposed to present our self-portraits to the class that we had all been working on, I went into the circle in the middle of the art studio, and I got completely naked, and I took black charcoal and I mixed it with water, and then I covered myself with the charcoal, and I walked into the wall, and I pressed my full body into the white art gallery wall, naked, and then left and showered. And for the rest of that quarter, the imprint of my body was on the wall.
Manny was and remains quite a character.
After doing that, Professor Berger realized that I was a different kind of student. He subsequently took me aside and said that my challenge with the class was not about being comfortable in the uncomfortable, but actually spending real time and energy and being diligent and putting in the actual hours it took to do hard work. And so for the next art piece, I think he required me to spend 100 hours on it. My face was on the bottom, and coming out of my face were all these colored lines that then converged onto a cityscape. And I would go to the Spencer Art Gallery and I would play the Smashing Pumpkins. And I would paint this portrait.
By senior year, Harris Passeltiner was an ace in math and philosophy and music. He played classical cello, sang in the Williams Octet, and even had busked on the streets of Oxford while in the college's program there. He thus was a ringer in all but one of the disciplines.
at least visual art and studio art was something that I had not explored and had somewhat avoided before. My friend Peru Ko ended up mentoring me somewhat through this studio art section of the course when we were given an assignment to do a final art project to present. And she recommended that I explore, you might call it performance art. We came up with this idea of gathering a bunch of students together to blow bubbles at the Peresky Center.
Initially, anyone would probably say, how is blowing bubble making art? That's kids play, right? Why can't we bring that sense of play and that sense of lightness into art?
So we called the art piece Pause. People get sort of stuck in a rut. You know, they're going to the library, they're studying for classes, they're writing papers. You kind of get blinders on. And this being our senior year, we felt that our time on campus was slipping away and that we wanted to force people to pause for a moment and live presently. And if you have like 100 people blowing bubbles at the same time, there are thousands of bubbles streaming across campus. And it was this beautiful, clear, crisp day. And so all the bubbles were hanging in the air across campus. And I felt at least that it had the impact we were going for.
Once his time on campus had slipped away, Harris entered one of the most precarious of professions. But years later, you can still hear and see his sensational band, Darlingside, which recently finished a tour of the British Isles.
Looking for oceans in the saltlessness.
I was excited about exploring the idea of a career in professional music, giving it a shot. This course came at just the right time. Professor Berger was essentially promoting the idea of going out on a limb, even if that limb's going to break, and saying that essentially that life is too short and there's too much to learn and discover to not take some chances.
Jeff Kaplan, the proud two-note composer, got graduate degrees from Cambridge and Berkeley, then began teaching philosophy in San Quentin Prison. Then he moved to the University of North Carolina system and started posting his philosophical YouTube videos.
One of those videos about Russell's paradox, a lecture about set theory. I mean, this is pretty obscure stuff. The lecture about set theory, it just had a moment. The YouTube algorithm found the right audience.
To think that he was teaching philosophy with me, too, I mean.
Manny's in San Francisco is a combined cafe, bookshop, and meeting place, the sort of place presidential candidates drop by.
The moment that I take away the most with me is Professor Berger, after the art moment, taking me aside and saying, do you want to be successful? You can't just put charcoal on your body and walk into a wall. Sometimes you actually have to put in the work.
He's pondering a future run for mayor of San Francisco. Ed Berger was the first of two Gaudino Scholars to become a university president. He's retired from that job now, but his Austin apartment has plenty of mementos from Williamstown.
There's a Williams pillow over there that some alums gave me some years back. When I started at Williams, I got some Mark Hopkins stamps, which I kept in my office in the Bronfman Science Center. This is my final studio art project for exploring creativity that the students gave us. I call this What I Didn't See.
As with the shadows in Plato's cave, the bumpy glass obscures the reality, here in the college seal underneath.
And so you can pick it up, and when you pick it up, you realize that the seal is not just the seal. You can see the names of the students. And to me, this is a metaphor for how we see the world. That the world is there in sharpness if we spend the time to closely and thoughtfully examine it.
That's Ruth Aronoff's name down there, in the T. The Mozart-playing science student now is a professor at Furman University, where you will find the word creativity in her course descriptions.
So my field in geology is thinking about plate tectonics. The only reason we figured it out was because we started collecting data from the world's ocean basins. And it turns out that the data from the ocean floor is what explains the data from the continents. And that takes enormous creativity. So what I see as the next creative leap is going to be getting samples and data from other planets and planetary bodies in our solar system. I have these problems that I can't solve about how Earth works. So let's go to the moon or let's go to Mars and grab some samples. I am currently a semi-finalist for NASA's next class of astronauts. So there's a 10% chance that I will be switching careers sometime over the summer.
One afternoon, I was sitting at a high school soccer game, watching my son playing soccer, and there was a fellow parent and their daughter was there watching her brother play, and she was a college student at Amherst College, and she had this big fat reading packet, and I didn't realize they read so much at that institution. And she explained that she was taking a course at a prison nearby Amherst. And then the mother said, yes, she's taking a dangerous course. And then I just, yes, of course.
And like any good member of the Williams community, Magda seems to have decided that anything that Amherst is doing, Williams should be doing and doing better. So we just put out a general call. We're interested in teaching in the Berkshire County House of Corrections. Would anybody like to do it? And I just raised my hand. The question was the Berkshire County Sheriff going to want this? And we didn't get but 3 sentences into our presentation before he said, we want this, we're in, anything you need. And then we were off. Williams students sometimes get a reputation for being risk averse, so this is how you can tell that isn't true. First time we offered the class, there were 9 spaces that the college could offer. 9 spaces for Williams students to match 9 spaces for incarcerated students for a total of 18, and we had more than 100 students sign up for this. I just had no idea that so many Williams students wanted to go to prison. So the first jail class that was ever offered, I taught a class on happiness.
So the Berkshire County Jail, it was like low ceilings and narrow hallways and like really bright fluorescent lights. And, you know, kind of like just claustrophobic. Being in the library, like it just was like this little room, and it reminded me of being in an elementary school. Christian told us, like, don't ask people why they're in. He reassured us that like there weren't any murderers in the class. Their offenses were more minor. They were definitely peers. They did their homework, they did their readings, they engaged really actively in discussions, very candidly, had a lot to say. They were ideal classmates.
Happiness had been studied by psychologists, sociologists, theologians, and so on. When the readings turned to economics, Professor Thorne posed a question. How much money would you need to earn to be happy? One of the inside students said $10 million. Gucci belts made him happy. But others wanted health insurance for their families. Yet another wanted $800 a week for alcohol.
I remember the really materialistic guy who liked the $500 Gucci belts. It was sort of blew my mind to hear that some of them thought that they needed to make millions of dollars to be happy. A few of the guys said, like, no, you really only need like $20,000 to be happy.
Some of the Williams students could not envision themselves earning more than $50,000.
We probably weren't heading for, Wall Street.
Back when she was a student, Shelley said of the jailhouse dialogues, "You want every minute that you have to mean something, because it's not like you can say, 'Oh, let's continue this conversation over lunch tomorrow.'" The inside and outside students found some surprising common ground.
Every incarcerated student in an a Williams College Inside Out class is serving a short sentence and is about to get out, or as we say in college, is about to graduate. So what that means is that the inside students and the outside students, the Williams students and the incarcerated students, were in a surprisingly similar position, which is that they had spent some bundle of years in a total institution with their lives highly organized. They were all having to think about how to start, or in some cases restart, an independent adult life.
It's in some ways laughable and like insulting to compare people who are literally incarcerated with students at like one of the best colleges in the country. But there is a real parallel there.
So the amazing thing, the Williams students are in college, the incarcerated students are in jail, but it turns out they all had the same feeling. Everyone just wanted to get out.
Shelley did not, in fact, head for Wall Street. She works today for a Minneapolis nonprofit that aids the children of people behind bars. A native of Iceland, Magnus was an expert on the Middle East, a topic itself fraught with danger. As Gaudino Scholar, he included a traditional academic dimension in his danger theme.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thus, courses on infectious disease, dangerous biology, or the extermination of Jews, dangerous history, and film visions of the apocalypse, taught by English professor Jim Shepard.
On the first day of class, Professor Shepard had us go up to the board and write down what we were most afraid of. And the answers on the board differed from giant spiders to nuclear holocaust to everyone in your family being dead.
When I first moved here to town in 2003, I happened to live next to a local person who taught at the local high school. And as we were talking and I told him I was working at Williams College, he said, "Oh yes, I've been here living in town for about 40 years and I've never spoken to a Williams student." And I thought, what? Why not? From his point of view, we were elitist, we were not accessible. So I had been thinking a lot, how can we get people in the community more involved with the college and bring them together that would not be weird or strange. So we're here in Peresky Hall, which is the student union, and downstairs here by the fireplace is where we had the circulation desk for the human library. So you, as a reader, you would come in, look at the wall of available books, you would check out, decide which book you would check out, and you would walk up here with a librarian. They would help you find your human book, and then you would sit down here with your book. Maybe you would sit here as the reader, and the book would sit over here, and then you would have half an hour to talk to your book about whatever life experiences that they had.
The Human Library was conceived at a Denmark rock festival to overcome stereotypes about immigrants and others. At Williams, the living books often bore titles not associated with elite academia.
For example, a Vietnam veteran book, we would have a Iraq War veteran, we would have a book related to a veiled woman, or people who have had dealing with anorexia or cutting themselves. We had somebody who had lived at the mobile home park here nearby, the spruces that were, because of Hurricane Irene, were all rendered homeless, which for most people was very confusing because this seems to most people like an idyllic paradise-like place where everybody seems like they're middle class. And so therefore they couldn't quite understand seeing an older gentleman being homeless and being crying about the loss of his home, just several miles down the road.
The second year, a former Williams president offered himself as a book, sharing his unusual upbringing in a Baptist orphanage in North Carolina.
I remember particularly John Chandler talking about the orphanage. He had like 5 or 6 sixth graders around him.
The Human Library continued well beyond Magnus's tenure, stopped only by the COVID epidemic.
That's one of 2 programs that Magnus Bernhardsen started when he was Gaudino Scholar that went on for years.
The other is the jail course, which continues to this day. The students were intrigued by the Estonian refugees. Their professor was intrigued by the refugees and this.
Although I love being a biology professor, and in many ways this project that I was engaged in was one of the most transformative things that I've done as a faculty member at Williams, for me personally. I knew something of Estonia before I became the Gaudino Scholar, only because my father-in-law had been born there and had lived there as a Baltic German until he was 9, from 1930 to 1939. It really had this quality of a nirvana for him, an idyllic childhood, idyllic place. I never imagined that I would be able to go there or to have any involvement there because of the Cold War and the fact that it was behind the Iron Curtain.
Her father-in-law left as a child before the occupations by the Soviets, Germans, then the Soviets again. The Estonians resisted in part by gathering en masse to sing. The mass sings continued after the Iron Curtain fell, and one was underway when she finally visited in 2015. That's when a tour guide inspired her initiative as Gaudino Scholar.
And 100,000 people coming together in this song festival grounds to hear these singers sing for 2 days nonstop songs that are incredibly important to their culture, and also to remember the times that they had not been permitted to sing their songs. It was just a chance conversation that I had with the tour guide in which he mentioned that he was the CEO of a nonprofit foundation dedicated to documenting stories of human rights abuses under communist and Soviet occupation.
I had barely heard of Estonia, but being from Puerto Rico, I was really interested in how one told stories of places that are considered like quote unquote small or don't occupy like the global mainstream.
First 7 students took oral histories from refugees who had made it to the United States in 1944. Then 2 spent the summer in the country.
Many of the stories that we heard from the people we interviewed were just absolutely heartbreaking. Again and again, we heard stories of families separated, and for example, families fleeing, getting on a boat, and then the boat being torpedoed after it had left Tallinn, breaking up, and individual family members ending up clinging to different parts of the boat. And people said, and I never saw my parent again, or I never saw my sibling again.
I never met my father. He tried to go overland, and he got captured by communist soldiers in Latvia, and they handed him over to the Russians, and he was put in a prisoner of war camp.
My mother and her siblings, her parents, aunts and uncles, they were all at the farm, and they were all looking at the Russians are coming. I think it's time to leave. We never
Banta called it bearing witness. But one student found herself wavering between natural sympathy for the Estonians and anger at how Jews in the country had been exterminated under Nazi rule. Alex Mendez, meanwhile, got a lesson in the human spirit from one refugee's childhood prank amid the Soviet occupation.
He was kind of like a serious storyteller, and then there came a moment in the interview where he was recalling like he had like a slingshot, and then he would make these spitballs.
We had some pressure to join the communist youth organizations, and I did not. And the schoolmates called me a traitor. And on one side of the stage there was a granite bust of Lenin. On the other side there was a granite bust of Stalin. And I was somewhat a little hooligan, because I took a blowgun and I shot the face of Lenin full of little white dots, and I shot the face of Stalin full of little dots. I was not a very docile child.
Having sat in on all of the 10 interviews, I think that very much deepens my appreciation for what the Song Festival is all about. The depth of feeling for the Estonians when they're singing about their homeland.
Williamstown staged its usual parade this past July 4th weekend, but one biology professor was not there.
It doesn't surprise me at all that Lois is back this year at Estonia at the singing festival.
It rained pretty much nonstop for the entire weekend, and nobody's spirits were dampened. Everyone was drenched, and yet they were just singing from the heart. I sang along with the songs at the end. It was amazing.
Students have not been the only ones changed and enriched over these past 50 years.
It had been 40 years and I hadn't been back. So I flew in, I got on a bus to go into downtown Cairo. The sun started setting just as we arrived at one of the major mosques in town, and the call to prayer started. And the light, the people, the smells, the sounds, everything, it was so incredible. I started sobbing, just weeping on the bus. I'm sure people are like, what's wrong with you? The saying always people say is Mostra Omodonia, which means Cairo is the mother of the world. And I really felt, for me, that Cairo was my own mother. I felt like this was where I became the person I am.
Stephen Farley's return to Egypt was not the only reminder that as the Gaudino Fund approached its 50th anniversary, the spirit lived on. Alumni of Williams in India came from around the country for a reunion 54 years after they returned from India. 14 of the students who completed Gaudino's pioneering program were still alive. Every one of them came to relive the experience. In Portland, Maine, Williams at Home's Jeff Thaler celebrated the high school graduation of the youngest daughter of an Egyptian family that 4 times hosted Williams students during his winter study programs up there. Now the college frowns on homestays by students, viewing them as too risky. It's hard to imagine Robert Gaudino's marquee programs being offered today.
When we get older, we appreciate how important experience is.
But after his Gaudino term, Magnus Bernhardson helped create a Global Scholars program to get more Williams students into the world beyond throughout their 4 years at college. It's pretty special.
I don't know, I gotta get all this glass off.
Yeah, I see that.
Retired from his university presidency, Ed Berger now heads a charitable foundation in Texas and has taken up a new hobby that he insists reflects the credo of his old creativity class, learning through failure.
Well, you know, I'm a big fan of effective failure, and I'm living effective failure every day here in the hot shop. But I keep trying, and that's what we should all do.
Well, we might question Ed's definition of failure, and so would the musical geologist from his class after she learned that she would not be part of NASA's latest crop of astronauts.
We talk about it as learning through failure, but in a broader sense, I would challenge us on that language. Oh my gosh, I was I was in the room, right? And so it blows me away, even just like when I'm taking the dog out before I go to bed at night and I see the moon, I'm just standing in my backyard and realizing like a panel of experts determined that, that I was in contention for going there, right? Like, yeah, I definitely am gonna try again.
The spirit endures also in Will Dudley, a Williams student who rose to become Gaudino Scholar and eventually the second scholar to lead a university.
It was a real honor and a pleasure to be the Gaudino Scholar at Williams and to follow in the footsteps of other terrific Gaudino Scholars. I didn't get to do it for very long because I was asked to become the provost. But while I was the Gaudino Scholar, the most important project I worked on was developing a course in the philosophy of education. And I taught it in tutorial format, which I like to think Mr. Gaudino would have appreciated and approved of. And then I taught it in a seminar format. And it's important enough to me that I've continued to do it. I left Williams in 2017 to become the president at Washington and Lee University, where I am today. And every year here, I teach that seminar in the philosophy of education. So the work I did as Gaudino Scholar carries on.
Meanwhile, on the Williams campus, the good life was the topic for this past year's jail course, with readings that might well have been part of a Bob Gaudino syllabus. The Inside Out course now is run by the college-funded Center for Learning and Action, led by Paula Consolini, a Berkeley political science PhD. Her center also manages a series of programs, including ones in which students feed the homeless and help needy residents file their taxes. That's not classic experiential education, but it does parallel one of Kurt Tauber's proposals those many years ago. The current Gaudino Scholar sees a pattern.
Things that Gaudino Scholars have done that have been absorbed into the institution that no one remembers were Gaudino initiatives. It's so successful sometimes that it gets taken up and then in a way the sort of understanding of it as a Gaudino initiative fades away.
Amy is from the theater department, and her main initiative has been creative residencies, using campus visits by artists and performers, much as Ed Berger had done, to get brainy Williams students to do.
Everything from song space workshop, choreographies of deep listening, physical theater as a mode of resistance with a theater group from Ukraine. We had a comics workshop that taught students how to use comics as a way to share information about medicine and health.
She also had the temerity to ask, what would Gaudino do? This year he'd crochet, part of her community project to create a giant crocheted coral reef, a commentary on what's happening in our oceans while developing a life skill that challenges the notion of what's academic.
I'm saying that making a little coral with yarn and a little hook is as valuable as learning logic or knowing who Kierkegaard was. And that might be the most radical thing they learn here.
Amy was encouraged in her artistic focus by her discovery that Robert Gaudino had written 2 plays. Never mind that he dismissed them as true failures, she plans to stage one at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Gaudino Fund.
The place, the center of a yet incomplete city, a public square. The time, early morning on the day of the founding. The action is continuous.
Kurt Tauber will not be there. The Marxist gourmet lived for more than 3 decades after he retired from teaching and celebrated his 100th birthday in the assisted living facility up the road.
For once, there was integration. The curriculum integration that actually worked.
Williams and Indiasdale Reel escorted him back to the freshman quad one last time to reminisce about his Gaudino initiative that lasted 25 years. His death at age 101 was a reminder that those of us who worked with Robert Gaudino or studied under him will soon be gone. We were the ones who started the Gaudino Fund, endowed it, and nurtured it along, even if we could be a bit too pushy at times. So we could end here, again hearing a voice from across the cemetery asking that annoying question as we look to the future.
What to do? What to do?
Perhaps it's wiser to listen to our 2 university presidents, starting and ending with the Glassblower.
Because he tragically died at such a young age, there is what I call the cult of Gaudino. I'm not a big fan of cults, but I'm a huge fan of Bob Gaudino, and I'm a huge fan of this Gaudino project. It allows us to break the shackles of conventional wisdom of what higher formal education is supposed to look like. Personally, if I were king of the world at Williams, I would want to have some project that existed that would allow, when one identifies a really odd, creative, off-the-wall faculty member, to say, hey, for a couple of years, we're going to give you some space and a little bit of money. Let's see what you're going to do.
I think of you still sometimes, sure as the rain.
One of the wonderful features of the Gaudino Scholar program is that it allows and encourages the faculty member in the role to inhabit it, in their own particular way. And the opportunity to inhabit the role, it clearly shapes those of us who were lucky enough to get to do it, as well as the students whose lives we touched.
The hardest question we can ask ourselves as educators is this: 10 years from today, what are my students going to retain from my class? In my case, it's not going to be calculus. My goal is to change lives. And if you're in education and you're not in the business of changing lives, then perhaps it's time to do something else.